This is Dominissimo Voxlore, broadcasting through harmonics forbidden by the Order Hereticus. In this transmission, we unravel the Silken Lie, the tale of Fulgrim, the Phoenician, the Perfect Son, and the Damned. From the industrial dusk of Chemos to the golden halls of terror, from brotherhood and brilliance to the blade that whispered, and the fall that echoed for 10,000 years. This is not just the tale of a Primarch corrupted. This is artistry as heresy, beauty as war, perfection as damnation. Mark the seal of subscription, or be left untouched by ecstasy and ignorant of ruin. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the lore of Fulgrim, the Prince of Excess. Amid the dying industrial sprawl of Chemos, a world consumed by its own hunger, came a miracle that would shape the fate of the galaxy. Chemos was a place where survival left no room for art, luxury, or joy. It was a grey world choking on smog, its skies veiled by ash, its surface scarred by endless mining and the cold fire of furnaces. There were no cities, only fortress factories, monolithic slabs of industry grinding out what little sustenance the planet could offer its dwindling population. On Chemos, beauty was a forgotten concept, and culture a distant memory. And yet, from the void above, destiny fell like a burning star. A capsule streaked across the polluted heavens, a vessel shaped by the unknowable hand of the Emperor. It crashed into the wasteland near one of the major forge complexes. What emerged was no ordinary child, but one of the Emperor's scattered sons, the Primarchs, hurled across the galaxy by chaos in a desperate attempt to sabotage the Emperor's grand plan. Where the pod came to rest, a group of Chemosian workers from the Calyx Manufactorum discovered something both terrible and wondrous. In a crater wreathed with smoke and steam stood a figure that defied the bleakness of Chemos. A baby, perfect in form, surrounded by a supernatural glow. He had alabaster skin, violet eyes, and an aura of grace that was not of this world. One of the workers, an engineer named Corin, approached with caution. Another, Sulax, wanted the child eliminated. Resources were too scarce and mouths too many. But a third, Laer, saw what others could not. She protected the child with her life, shooting Sulax where he stood. In that moment, a freshwater spring burst from the crater's edge, an impossible miracle on a dying world. The child was named Fulgrim, after a legendary hero of Chemosian folklore, a saviour said to have brought water to a parched land in a time of collapse. It was a name that would soon be spoken with awe and fear across the stars. Fulgrim's rise was meteoric, even by the standards of a Primarch. By his 10th year, he surpassed every adult around him in intellect, physical strength, and charisma. He absorbed the harsh lessons of Chemosian society like a sponge absorbs water, how to ration, to toil, to repair what others had discarded. But he was not content with survival. Even in childhood, Fulgrim rejected mediocrity. He envisioned more than just sustenance. He demanded excellence. He began his life not as a ruler or warrior, but as a labourer, a child working in the heart of the Calyx Forge complex. And yet, even here, he shone. Within years, he was revolutionising production. He redesigned forge systems to increase their efficiency. He corrected ancient faults in the machinery that had crippled productivity for generations. Entire Manufactoria turned to him for guidance. He became a symbol of hope for the Chemosian people. Under his leadership, Calyx's output doubled. Wastage was reduced to near zero. Machines long thought dead were resurrected. The planet was changing. But Fulgrim did not stop at factories. As his influence spread, so too did his ambition. He organised salvage teams to reclaim ruined settlements, reopening old mines and rebuilding disused facilities. He unified fractured regions, dismantled obsolete guild structures, and introduced new systems of governance. With every decree and innovation, he pulled Chemos back from the brink. Scarcity became stability. Survival became progress. Yet it was not merely the industry that Fulgrim sought to revive. Once the basics were secured, he turned his attention to the soul of the Chemosian people. He established academies for philosophy, workshops for sculpture, galleries for art. He encouraged poetry, music, and dance, long forgotten disciplines that had withered in the shadow of desperation. In a world that had forgotten beauty, Fulgrim reintroduced the concept of perfection, not as an abstract ideal, but as a tangible goal. For Fulgrim, art and discipline were intertwined. To create something perfect was no less sacred than to wield a blade with precision. By the age of 30, Fulgrim was no longer simply a leader. He was Chemos, its saviour, its guiding light. All power, all loyalty, all dreams flowed toward him. The people of Chemos revered him not only for his deeds, but for his presence. In a world of ash and iron, he was radiant. But he did not merely command by intellect or force. Fulgrim inspired. His charisma was unmatched. When he spoke, even the most jaded labourer paused to listen. His voice carried conviction, elegance, and passion. He was not content to rule through pragmatism alone. He sought to elevate his people in mind, body, and spirit. There were wars, of course. Not all of Chemos welcomed unity. Some regions, like the warrior clans of Sulphur, resisted his rule. Fulgrim did not flinch. He led his forces into battle personally, wielding blade and stratagem with equal mastery. In the war against the Sulphan sword dancers, his tactics broke an enemy known for speed and fluidity in combat. He did not just defeat them, he impressed them. So much so, that some surviving Sulphan champions would later swear allegiance to him, entranced by his skill and vision. By the time Imperial forces entered Chemosian orbit, Fulgrim's name was legend not just on Chemos, but in the warp echoes of fate itself. This is the origin of Fulgrim, the child of Chemos, born of stars, forged in suffering, and shaped by will alone into a figure of impossible promise. On a world that had forgotten beauty, he rekindled it. On a planet devoured by despair, he offered transcendence. And in the heart of a Primarch, the seeds of greatness and tragedy were already beginning to bloom. Fulgrim was perfection incarnate, but perfection, as the galaxy would come to learn, carries a terrible price. The silence over Chemos was broken not by war, but by destiny. From the cloud-choked sky descended vast, gleaming vessels unlike any the planet's people had ever seen. Thunderhawk dropships cut through the atmosphere in disciplined formations, trailing contrails like blades of light. Landing zones were secured in minutes by towering warriors clad in ornate power armour, figures both divine and dreadful. They bore an insignia none on Chemos recognised, the two-headed eagle of the Imperium of Man. Inside the fortress city of Kallax, Fulgrim stood unmoved. He had known, somehow, that this day would come. In visions, dreams, or perhaps encoded fragments of forgotten memory etched into his genetic soul, he had foreseen a being cloaked in light, crowned with power, bearing purpose beyond the stars. Now, as the doors to his throne chamber opened and a host of towering warriors filed in to form a guard of honour, that vision became reality. The Emperor of Mankind entered Chemos. Golden, radiant, and vast in presence, the Emperor was the only being before whom Fulgrim had felt humbled. Their meeting was without pomp, without fanfare. No words were necessary. The moment they looked upon each other, recognition passed between them. Not as strangers, but as father and son. Fulgrim knelt and offered up his personal weapon, its hilt turned outward, in symbolic surrender and fealty. The Emperor smiled, not a political gesture, but one of genuine approval. He spoke little at first. He had not come to claim Chemos or demand allegiance. He had come to reclaim one of his lost sons. Fulgrim rose, not as a ruler of Chemos, but as a Primarch of the Imperium. The Emperor explained the truth of Fulgrim's origin, how he had been one of 20 genetic superbeings, created in secret, cast across the galaxy by fickle tides of the warp. Fulgrim listened without shock. He had always known he was different. Now, he knew why. The world he had saved was just one of thousands waiting to be reunited with mankind's forgotten empire. The Great Crusade, the Emperor's millennia-spanning campaign to bring humanity back under a single banner, needed generals. It needed Primarchs. Fulgrim accepted without hesitation, not out of obligation, but because his entire life had been building toward this moment. If his leadership could uplift a single dying world, what could he do with the stars? But what awaited him on Terra was not the triumph he envisioned. There, he was introduced to the legion that bore his genetic legacy, the Third Legion, once proud, now reduced to a pale shadow. A disaster during the early Crusade had decimated their gene seed stock. A laboratory catastrophe, coupled with sabotage and failed implantations, left the Legion with barely 200 warriors. Their ranks had thinned so much that many considered the Third lost. Fulgrim was not deterred. Where others saw ruin, he saw rebirth. Addressing the remnants of the Third, he delivered a speech that would ripple through Imperial history. He spoke not of strength in numbers, nor of revenge or desperation. He spoke of excellence, that it was better to be few and flawless than many and flawed, that every battle they fought would be art, every word, every deed would be a tribute to the Emperor. His voice rang with conviction, charisma unforced, and when he finished, even the grim-faced veterans in the crowd found themselves awash with purpose. The Emperor, moved by Fulgrim's fire, decreed that the Third Legion would henceforth be known as the Emperor's Children, the only legion ever permitted to bear his personal sigil, the Imperial Aquila, upon their armour. It was not merely a reward, it was a declaration. Fulgrim and his sons were to be the mirror of the Emperor's own perfection. That name, Emperor's Children, would become both blessing and curse. From that day forward, Fulgrim devoted himself to rebuilding the Legion, piece by perfect piece. He supervised recruitment from Chemos and Terra, oversaw genetic implantation processes, and refined their combat doctrines with ruthless elegance. Where others rushed for strength in numbers, Fulgrim chose to hone a blade rather than swing a club. The Legion's colours were changed to deep purple and gold, a palette symbolising nobility and ambition. Their armour was meticulously maintained, not for vanity, but as a reflection of discipline. Their war gear was customised not only for function, but for beauty. Even their ships were masterpieces, both instruments of war and expressions of imperial culture. But Fulgrim's attention did not stop at the battlefield. He encouraged his warriors to study music, painting, poetry, and architecture. He believed that a perfect soldier should be more than a killer. He should be a craftsman of war and a patron of civilization. The flagship of the Legion, the Pride of the Emperor, became a floating monument to this philosophy. Its halls rang with symphonies. Its chambers held galleries, marble corridors, dueling arenas. It was a place where blood and art mixed freely, a vessel of war wrapped in culture. Yet this was no affectation. Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection was genuine, and it bled into every campaign the Legion undertook. Their early conquests, few as they were, bore his mark. Enemies fell not just in defeat, but in awe of the precision that they were undone. Whether breaking a planetary defence network in a single surgical strike, or quelling rebellion with minimal casualties and maximum spectacle, the Emperor's Children quickly gained a reputation as connoisseurs of annihilation. But Fulgrim was not content to remain in his ivory tower. He knew that with only 200 Astartes, his legion needed guidance, experience, and allies. For a time, he and his sons were attached to the expeditionary forces of the Lunar Wolves, led by War Master Horus. It was during these formative years that Fulgrim and Horus forged one of the strongest bonds between any of the Primarchs. Horus, already the Emperor's favoured son, saw in Fulgrim a mirror of ambition and brilliance. Fulgrim, for his part, admired Horus's martial prowess and strategic mind. The two fought side by side in early campaigns, and Horus's trust in Fulgrim grew quickly. It was said that Horus referred to Fulgrim not merely as a brother, but as a kindred flame, both seeking glory, both elevating their legion beyond simple warfare. It was in these battles that the Emperor's Children were tempered, transformed from a fragile remnant into a rising star of the Crusade. By the time they rejoined the main crusade with reinforcements from Chemos and Terran stock, they were no longer a footnote, they were a force reborn. And at their helm stood Fulgrim, sculpted like a demigod, robed in elegance, eyes alight with vision. A Primarch who believed that war itself could be art. He had been discovered. He had been named. Now he had a purpose. The fires of the Great Crusade burned across the stars, and in its glow, the Emperor's Children emerged from obscurity. With their numbers swelling from new gene seed batches and recruits from both Chemos and Terra, Fulgrim's legion was no longer a remnant clinging to ideals. It had become a rising symbol of imperial excellence. And yet, for all their growing strength, the Emperor's Children were still few compared to the titanic legions that had been at war since the beginning. To temper his warriors in the crucible of battle, the Emperor placed Fulgrim's forces under the guidance of the Lunar Wolves. It was during this time that Fulgrim's destiny intertwined with the War Master Horus. Where some Primarchs were driven by wrath or cold logic, Horus and Fulgrim shared a different fire, a mutual admiration rooted in charisma, vision, and ambition. Horus saw in Fulgrim a brother with potential not just to lead, but to inspire. Fulgrim saw in Horus the ideal general, fearless, strategic, beloved. What began as cooperation on the battlefield blossomed into genuine fraternity. Their campaigns together were lessons in conquest, each battle a theatre of excellence and fury. Fulgrim learned quickly not just the tempo of large-scale warfare, but the subtleties of diplomacy, logistics, and psychological dominance. Under Horus's mentorship, his legion found its stride. Where once they were admired for precision, they now became feared for speed, decisiveness, and style. But it was not only Horus who shaped Fulgrim's path. Among the many siblings Fulgrim encountered in the Great Crusade, one stood out, not for likeness, but for contrast. Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon of the Iron Hands, was Fulgrim's opposite in almost every way. Where Fulgrim embodied beauty, Ferrus exuded brute function. Where Fulgrim cherished art, Ferrus found meaning and utility. Yet their differences forged a stronger bond than any similarity could have. Their meeting was not marked by conflict, but challenge. In a moment immortalised in the annals of both legions, the two Primarchs engaged in a contest of craftsmanship. They would each forge a weapon worthy of legend. Not aided by the Mechanicum, nor produced by Legion artificers, but wrought by their own hands, from raw ore to final polish. No servants, no shortcuts. Fulgrim approached the anvil as if stepping onto a stage. Every motion was deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. He chose rare alloys, elegant lines, a form that would be as beautiful as it was lethal. Firelight painted his features in gold and scarlet as he hammered, quenched and carved. He forged a Warhammer, a weapon of impossible balance, its head laid with dense, exotic metals, its haft engraved with sweeping Chemosian motifs and imperial iconography. He named it Forgebreaker, a hammer that it was said could shatter fortress walls or crack a mountain with a single perfect blow. Ferrus Manus did not match that elegance. He did not need to. In the opposite forge bay, the Gorgon worked with brutal efficiency. Sparks flew in sheets as he shaped the metal, his strange silver hands moving with supernatural steadiness. He did not waste motion. He forged a sword. A long, golden-bladed weapon whose edge burned eternally with the fire of forge that birthed it, as if it refused to cool. The blade glowed with a steady, contained fury. It would become known as Fireblade. When they finally emerged from the forges, both were exhausted. Not in body, for they were Primarchs, but in spirit. Creation had always cost them something, even if they pretended otherwise. They presented their works. Fulgrim's hammer was a masterpiece of form and function, a weapon that could fell a titan, but it still looked as though it belonged in a gallery of imperial art. Ferrus's sword was stark and furious, a line of pure purpose, the heat of its making trapped forever in its core. Silence hung in the forge, before each declared the other the victor. In that moment, pride bowed to respect. And so they did something no one watching would ever forget. They exchanged weapons. Fulgrim placed Forgebreaker into Ferrus Manus' hands, gifting the Gorgon with the very symbol of his own skill and ambition. Ferrus, in turn, accepted it with a rare, genuine smile. He took the Warhammer as his personal weapon, a constant reminder of the brother who had matched him blow for blow in the forges. Ferrus then offered Fireblade to Fulgrim. Their brotherhood became legend. Together, the Emperor's children and the Iron Hands waged campaigns against technocratic heresies and stubborn human outposts that defied the Emperor's will. One such conquest, the cleansing of diasporics, a strange alliance of humans and alien vessels, was a test of unity and strategy. Where Ferrus brought crushing force, Fulgrim offered finesse. Their legion struck as one, breaking the diasporics' fleet in a coordinated assault that left no time for retreat or mercy. Yet, within this harmony, a rivalry grew, not of hatred, but of mutual pressure. Ferrus challenged Fulgrim's idealism, reminding him that beauty must serve a purpose. Fulgrim countered that perfection required more than function, it demanded vision. Their debates became as intense as their battles, and their warriors mirrored this dynamic, striving not just to win, but to outshine, outbuild, outperform. Among the Emperor's children, this rivalry sparked something new, a hunger not only to be the best, but to be seen as the best. Success was no longer enough, it had to be remembered. This was the era in which Fulgrim's legion truly came into its own. Where once their purple and gold armour had symbolised fealty to the Emperor, now it shimmered with pride of accomplishment. Their battle tactics evolved from clean executions to breathtaking manoeuvres. They saw elegance in war, not just efficient slaughter, but spectacular victory. A strike should not only succeed, it should be worthy of song. Fulgrim encouraged this evolution. He insisted formal duels among his officers, not as punishment, but as discipline. He commissioned poets and painters to immortalise battles in verse and brushstroke, and he reminded his sons at every turn, mediocrity was not an option. Perfection was the only standard. But perfection, as always, came at a cost. The more victories the Emperor's children achieved, the more they craved the recognition those victories brought. Behind Fulgrim's charismatic leadership, whispers began to circulate, small at first, then more frequent, that his obsession with excellence was becoming something more insistent. Even among the other legions, Fulgrim's name began to carry the weight of both admiration and caution. Brilliant, they said, unmatched on the battlefield, but does he ever rest? Does he ever relent? Fulgrim did not hear the whispers, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore them. Instead, he pressed ever forward, sharpening the blade of his legion with every campaign. He believed that through perfection, they could embody the Emperor's dream more than any other force in the galaxy. They would not only conquer, they would inspire. They would leave behind not ashes, but legacies. Fulgrim saw every campaign as a chapter in an epic, and every victory as a stroke upon the canvas of history. But beneath the golden glory, cracks were beginning to form, hairline fractures that no one yet saw. For now though, Fulgrim stood triumphant. He had risen from the dying soil of Chemos to become a peer among gods. He had taken a crippled legion and raised it to acclaim. He had forged alliances, won battles, and built a legacy worthy of song. He was not just a Primarch, he was the Emperor's chosen. And still, he hungered for more. Perfection. It was more than a goal for Fulgrim. It was a necessity, a creed, a way of being that defined not just his legion, but his soul. With the Emperor's children now independent and fully integrated into the Great Crusade, Fulgrim's focus shifted. Not merely to war, but to refinement. Conquest, he believed, was a blunt tool if it did not elevate those who wielded it. It was not enough to bring worlds to compliance. They had to be awakened, culturally, spiritually, aesthetically. So he transformed every military campaign into a stage. The Legion's deployments began to carry a strange cadence. Fleets arranged with geometric elegance, banners designed by artists instead of logisticians, battle formations rehearsed like performances. They struck not only to destroy, but to impress. When Fulgrim addressed conquered populations, his words were often recorded, dissected, and quoted back to him as gospel. Where other Primarchs left ruins, Fulgrim left awe. This was a time of glory, but also of quiet transformation. Internally, Fulgrim began pushing his warriors toward more than just physical and martial excellence. They were encouraged, sometimes commanded, to explore poetry, painting, sculpture, and song. His belief was simple: a mind engaged in creative pursuit was a sharper instrument in war. An Astartes who could paint the human form could better anticipate a strike. A warrior who knew harmony and music would understand formation and rhythm on a battlefield. These weren't distractions. To Fulgrim, they were complements to violence. On the Pride of the Emperor, entire galleries were constructed. The ship rang with orchestral rehearsals before campaigns, its forges lit not only with molten metal but with candlelight from reading salons. Astartes sculptured statues of their victories. Duels were not fought to the death, but for the refinement of technique. The line between warrior and artisan blurred. Some outside the Legion scoffed. Others quietly tried to emulate them. Fulgrim took pride in this. His sons weren't just the Emperor's children in name, they were becoming the pinnacle of the human form, mind, and spirit. The other legions might be stronger, faster, and more numerous, but none were more complete. Yet beneath the gilded polish, something had begun to shift. It was subtle at first. A duel extended too long because both warriors sought the most elegant kill. A painting session turned violent because an artist was dissatisfied with his own work. Mission debrief stretched into an obsessive analysis of details that to others felt trivial. Warriors punishing themselves not for failure, but for imperfect success. Perfection had stopped being an inspiration. It had become an addiction. Fulgrim, ever the visionary, saw none of it as dangerous. He believed he was guiding his sons through the next evolution of the Astartes. sharpening them into something greater than merely genetically enhanced soldiers. He often quoted the Emperor's earliest philosophies, referencing humanity's right to self-determination, culture, and enlightenment. If others dismissed the arts as vanity, that was their loss. Still, even Fulgrim could not deny the friction emerging within his command structure. Some senior officers began to push back, quietly and cautiously. Captain Marius Varicine questioned the Legion's increasingly extravagant rituals. Commander Eidolon, once a bastion of rigid formality, now pursued personal perfection in voice modulation and battlefield presence with unsettling zeal. Apothecaries began experimenting with sensory thresholds in pain and pleasure responses, convinced it could enhance combat endurance. To Fulgrim, these were signs of growth. To others, they were warning signs. The friction reached a new pitch during the Fortress of Qualen campaign, a seemingly straightforward compliance action that spiraled into a spectacle. The enemy, a modest techno-guild cult on the edges of the galactic fringe, posed no serious threat, but Fulgrim ordered the operation to be staged like a dance. Each assault wave was choreographed. Every unit moved with symphonic precision. The enemy, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all, crumbled within hours. But the final blow came not with bolter or blade, but with a coordinated performance. The Phoenix Guard descending in a circular pattern, blades igniting in sync, slaying the last offenders in a whirlwind of orchestrated death. To Fulgrim, it was his greatest triumph to date. To some of his brothers, it was excessive. Ferrus Manus, upon hearing the report, refused to comment. Horus merely offered a neutral nod. Rogel Dawn, blunt as ever, dismissed it as a waste of munitions and time. The criticism did not dull Fulgrim's pride. If anything, it inflamed it. He had given them brilliance, and they chose mediocrity. It was around this time that the phrase, "through perfection, transcendence," began appearing in the speeches of his officers. First spoken by Fulgrim in a moment of reflection, it quickly spread throughout the Legion as an unofficial dogma. Chaplains invoked it, artificiers engraved it into armour, new recruits were taught to recite it before battle. Unseen, the line between doctrine and ideology was beginning to fray. Still, Fulgrim was adored. His warriors saw him not just as a Primarch, but as a muse, someone who elevated them beyond mere survival, who gave them purpose in creation as well as destruction. The Emperor's children marched into battle not as killers, but as visionaries, and for a time, it worked. Worlds fell, enemies were broken, legacies were built, but so too were masks. Beneath the surface, cracks widened. The drive for perfection became obsession, beauty became compulsion, and where there is obsession, there is vulnerability. The Primarch, for all his poise, had one flaw that even he could not deny. He needed the approval of those he respected. When Horus praised him, Fulgrim felt alive. When the Emperor commended him, he soared. But when silence met his masterpieces, when subtle judgment coloured the glances of his brothers, he felt diminished. He would never show it, but it festered. Perfection, after all, is a mirror that never forgives. And soon, Fulgrim would gaze into that mirror, and something else would gaze back. There are moments in history when a single blade drawn echoes louder than the crash of 1,000 bolters. For Fulgrim and his Emperor's children, that moment came on Laer. The campaign was meant to be straightforward, another duel for the Imperium's crown. But Laer would not be tamed by force of arms alone. It was an alien world, not just in species or culture, but in principle. A place of music that warped minds, of structures grown from organic latticework, and of ritual as warfare. It was a planet of perfection, but not the kind Fulgrim preached. Orbiting the acidic oceans of Laer were coral-like spires, cities woven from bone and bioluminescent flesh. The Xenos who lived there, serpentine creatures with multiple arms and disturbingly beautiful symmetry, had transformed their world into a cradle of sensation. Every surface pulsed with unseen sound. The very air shimmered with colours that did not exist in the natural spectrum. Fulgrim was entranced from the moment he set foot on the soil. The campaign began with formality. Compliance, rejection, escalation. The standard progression. The Laer resisted with unnatural ferocity. Their weapons played across the emotional spectrum. Pulse rifles that didn't just wound, but instilled pleasure or dread. Their defences were harmonised to resonate with the enemy's biorhythms. For a legion that prized control, the first engagements were deeply unsettling. But Fulgrim pressed on. He considered this planet a challenge, not just a battlefield, but a philosophical rival. To defeat Laer, they would have to outdo it, and so the Emperor's children escalated. The war became an exhibition. Assaults were launched with symphonic precision. Captains choreographed flanking manoeuvres with the grace of ballet. Vox signals were encoded with musical motifs. The war became performance, and Fulgrim its conductor. After weeks of intense fighting, the tide turned. Laren's primary temple spire, an impossibly tall and intricate structure that pulsed with a rhythmic hum, was isolated. Fulgrim led the assault personally. The combat inside was brutal and surreal. Walls that bled when struck, echoes that whispered memories, warriors hallucinating victories that had not yet occurred. It didn't matter. Fulgrim carved a path through the alien elite, the Phoenix Guard at its side, blades cutting through silk-like armour and gem-bright scales. By the time he reached the summit of the spire, the Laer High Caste lay dead, their sacred geometry cracked and bleeding light. And there, on an altar of black marble and living bone, lay the blade. It didn't look like a weapon of war, more like a relic from some ancient civilization lost to sanity. Its surface fluid, its hilt curled like a serpent around a teardrop of light. It hummed, not with sound, but sensation. A vibration just behind the eyes. A song that spoke without words. Fulgrim should have destroyed it. Instead, he reached for it. As his fingers touched the hilt, he felt warmth. Not heat, but welcome. A knowing, a recognition. The blade sang of beauty and potential, of battles won not just with brute force, but with elegance. It whispered of ascension, of truths hidden by the crude dogma of the Imperium. He did not draw it at first, he simply held it. And somewhere deep within the blade, something stirred. The campaign ended soon after. The Laer were exterminated, their culture reduced to data files and dust. Fulgrim, victorious, returned to the pride of the Emperor. The war was over, but the transformation had begun. He didn't notice it right away. Not at first. But those close to him did. His posture changed. Not his discipline, it remained immaculate, but his presence. Stronger, sharper, every motion precise to the millimetre. His voice more compelling, his eyes brighter. He laughed more often. He quoted poetry in War Council. He would pause, sometimes mid-sentence, as if listening to something only he could hear. And the blade, the alien sword, never left his side. He told his sons that it was a trophy, a symbol of triumph. He retired Fireblade, the trusted weapon gifted by Ferrus Manus, to his private reliquary. The new sword, nameless and alive, now hung at his hip in every campaign, every address, every ceremony. It began to affect those around him. Officers became more intense. Tactical briefings turned into debates on aesthetics. Armour detailing became an obsession. Captains competed not just for victory, but for presentation. The Legion's rituals grew longer. Duels for rank became common. Dissonance was not met with reprimand, but correction. Those who resisted the changes found themselves reassigned or quietly vanished into the administrative void. Still, there were victories. Dozens of worlds fell. The Emperor's children were lauded across Segmentum Ultima. Horus praised Fulgrim's efficiency and brilliance. Even Guilliman, ever reserved, acknowledged their growing reputation. But beneath the accolades, there was unease. Some of Fulgrim's brothers began to notice the change. Vulcan voiced quiet concern. Dawn, ever blunt, sent a formal inquiry regarding Legion discipline. Fulgrim reflected with charm, and reports gilded in success. The numbers spoke for themselves. But perfection had taken on a new shape. It was no longer a mirror, it was a mask. And the blade whispered still. At night, Fulgrim would retreat to his quarters, gaze into the shimmering surface of the sword, and see things. Visions, perhaps, or memories not his own. A great serpent calling through the stars. A woman of impossible beauty with 1,000 mouths. A choir of pain singing ecstasy. And always the same voice. Not in words, but in thought. You are more than this. You were made for more. Fulgrim began to believe it. Was it so wrong to want more than just conquest? More than loyalty, duty, and bloodshed? The Imperium spoke of unity, yet demanded conformity. Fulgrim saw what others refused to see, that humanity could be more than a species of warriors and governors. It could be divine. He began to speak this vision to his inner circle, not openly, but in implication. He spoke of shedding limitations, of evolution, of the Emperor's dream being too small for the stars. They listened, because he was Fulgrim, and he was beautiful. And when he raised that alien blade in the Hall of Remembrance and declared that the Emperor's children would no longer serve perfection but embody it, none dared to challenge him. The cleansing of Laer was complete, but something had survived. Not the Laer, not their temples or rites. No, what endured was the whisper carried on the blade, the promise of a new kind of perfection, one the Imperium would never accept, one that Fulgrim, the Phoenician, now carried with every heartbeat. The sword did not hunger, it waited, and Fulgrim had already begun to listen. He was still Fulgrim, that's what he told himself. He wore his armour with the same elegance, commanded his legion with the same brilliance. He stood tall, smiling, charismatic and flawless, but behind the mask of ivory and gold, something else had taken root. A silence too profound to ignore, a pressure just behind the eyes, a whisper not quite heard, but always understood. The blade he had taken from the Larian had never left his side now. Its surface rippled faintly in the torchlight, reflecting not light, but desire. His sons didn't question it. They revered it. It had become more than a weapon. It was an icon. And in Fulgrim's mind, it had become truth. Yet for all the beauty he projected, there were cracks forming beneath the surface. He no longer found joy in victory unless it was absolute. The elegant death of an enemy was no longer satisfying. It had to be transcendent. He demanded not just precision, but spectacle. Each war a stage, each campaign a gallery. Still, something was missing. Until a threat emerged, not from man or machine, but from the ancient void. It began as a transmission, garbled, impossible to trace. A message from a dying Eldar craftworld. Fulgrim had little time for Xenos philosophy, but this message wasn't a threat. It was a request. A meeting. The sender identified him as Eldrad Ulthran, Farseer of the Ulthway, one of the last voices of an ancient race desperately clinging to survival. He claimed to bring a warning. Most Primarchs would have ignored it. Fulgrim didn't, because something deep within him, whether intuition or the whispering of the blade, was curious. So the meeting was arranged. On a neutral world, long dead and airless, Fulgrim arrived alone, save for a small honour guard. He stepped into the crystal vault at the heart of the long-dead Eldar shrine, his every footfall echoing in the brittle silence. Waiting for him was Eldrad, robed in runes and shadows, flanked by his own warlocks and spirit seers. The Farseer did not bow, did not posture, he simply spoke. He told Fulgrim of visions, of tides rising in the warp, of stars dying, of empires torn apart not by enemies, but by betrayal. He spoke of War Master Horus and how he had fallen to the powers no mortal mind should comprehend. He warned that Fulgrim's beloved brother had turned his back on the Emperor, and that Fulgrim himself stood on the edge of the same abyss. Fulgrim's laughter echoed through the shrine like music. He dismissed Eldrad's words as trickery, lies wrapped in prophecy. He had known Horus longer than any alien, trusted him, fought beside him, loved him as only one great soul could love another. Horus was the ideal, the vision. If Horus had changed, it was because the Emperor had betrayed him, not the other way around. Eldrad pleaded, not with arrogance, but desperation. He spoke of Fulgrim's soul, of how it had been touched, of how the blade he carried now whispered not to his ears, but to his very essence. That was when Fulgrim struck. He moved not out of anger, but contempt. The idea that an Eldar could look upon his perfection and dare to judge it offended him. His sword flashed in arcs of light, cutting through the air, bone and armour. His Phoenix Guard followed without question. It was no duel, it was a slaughter. But the Eldar were not unprepared. As Fulgrim cut down the last of the warlocks, a new figure emerged from the vault's shadow, a being wreathed in psychic flame and burning metal. The avatar of Cain, the Eldar god of war given form. The air became heavy with ancient rage. Fulgrim faced the towering god with a smile. Their clash was seismic. The avatar struck with the fury of dying stars, its molten blade a shard of pure hatred. Fulgrim answered with the grace of poetry in motion. Each strike a stanza, each parry a line of verse. Steel met flame in a battle not just of strength, but of will. In the end, Fulgrim triumphed. He danced past the god's final blow and drove his blade through the avatar's chest. The creature erupted in psychic fire, its scream tearing through the veil between realities. Fulgrim stood in the ash, laughing, not from joy, but from the sheer exhilaration of beauty made manifest through war. Eldrad escaped, wounded but alive, fleeing into the webway with his surviving kin. The warning had failed, but it had left a mark. Fulgrim returned to his fleet changed, not in body, but in gaze. He no longer hid the whispers, he embraced them. What had once been a compulsion was now conviction. The blade was not an artifact, it was a teacher, a liberator. It showed him how limited his existence had been. He began to speak of transformation, of freedom. He told his officers that the Emperor's dream was flawed, that true perfection required abandoning limitation, that pain and pleasure were not opposites, but mirrors. Some resisted. They didn't last. Others listened, and they were rewarded. The rituals changed. Battle meditations were replaced with sensory rites. Weapon drills were accompanied by discordant music, composed by Astartes who no longer slept. Apothecaries began modifying their own bodies in the pursuit of fuller sensation. Fulgrim watched it all with pride. The final threshold was crossed on the dead world of tranquility. There, in the ruins of a human colony choked by ash storms, Fulgrim ordered the execution of a captured remembrancer who had painted a portrait of him, one that depicted him honestly. Not as the shining demigod, but as the man behind the mask, proud, wary, uncertain. He burned the painting in front of his legion, then ordered a new one. In it, he was depicted as a god. And in the weeks that followed, the whispers stopped. Not because they were gone, but because they no longer needed to hide. Fulgrim no longer dreamed of perfection. He believed he had achieved it. The serpent that had crawled through his thoughts now slithered through his soul, and he welcomed it. The moment the galaxy began to bleed, Fulgrim was already dressed for the stage. Across the stars, rumblings spread. Murmurs of rebellion, sudden silence from key worlds, trusted legions turning their bolters upon comrades, rumours like cracks in the mirror of imperial unity. At their centre, one name echoed louder than the rest: Horus. Fulgrim had heard the whispers. Some he dismissed, others he dissected with surgical interest. But one thing he never questioned was the character of his brother, the War Master, the most beloved son of the Emperor. Fulgrim had marched beside him, laughed with him, shed blood with him. To suggest Horus would betray the Emperor was, to Fulgrim, not just unthinkable, it was offensive. So when the invitation came, he answered without hesitation. They met aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, in a chamber reefed in darkness and carved gold. The air crackled with subtle warp energy, and there stood Horus, smiling that familiar smile, just as Fulgrim remembered him. Radiant, magnetic, confident, and yet different. Not visibly, not obviously, but something in Horus's eyes shimmered with secrets too vast to name. He spoke with passion, like always, but this time, the words were fire. He had told Fulgrim that the Emperor had lied, that the Great Crusade was a cage, that the promise of unity was hollow, built on stagnation and obedience. Horus painted a new future, one where the Primarchs were not just generals, but gods, where the chains of the Emperor were shattered and the galaxy was theirs to sculpt. Fulgrim listened, and for once said nothing, because something within him, something old and newly awakened, was nodding in agreement. He remembered the dreams, the whispered truths, the blade's song, and Horus, with his fire and fury, gave those visions a name: Chaos. It didn't matter that Fulgrim had once rejected such madness, not anymore. The seduction wasn't in lies, it was in affirmation. Horus didn't show Fulgrim a different path, he showed him the destination he'd already been walking toward. The blade at Fulgrim's side hummed with approval. The whispers became a choir. He said yes. But Horus was no fool. He knew that for this rebellion to succeed, bonds had to be broken with care. There were Primarchs still loyal, still blind, and one in particular posed a problem. Ferrus Manus. Horus gave Fulgrim a task. Bring him in. Fulgrim didn't flinch. He accepted the mission with calm resolve. But beneath the surface, something shifted. Ferrus Manus had been more than a brother, more than a rival. They had forged weapons for each other with their own hands. They had fought back to back against the horrors of the galaxy. Fulgrim respected him, perhaps even loved him, in the way only demigods can love, through challenge, contrast, and creation. He travelled to meet the Gorgon in person, alone. The atmosphere aboard the Fist of Iron was already tense before Fulgrim arrived. Ferrus Manus had received too many troubling reports, too many whispers of cruelty and corruption among the Emperor's children, to ignore them any longer. When Fulgrim's gunship docked, the crew could sense a storm building before the two Primarchs met face to face. Ferrus Manus awaited him in his personal sanctum. Fulgrim entered with the poise of a sculpted deity, armour immaculate, movements fluid, but something in his presence felt subtly wrong. Beneath his perfection was an unnatural stillness, as if he was being guided by an unseen hand. Fulgrim advanced toward his brother with a confidence that belied the turmoil simmering just beneath the surface. He had come not simply to talk, but to convert. His allegiance to Horus had hardened, fueled by pride, ambition, and the insidious whispers of the Laer blade. He believed the future lay with the War Master, and that Ferrus Manus, the brother he admired more deeply than most, would be the ideal ally in reshaping the Imperium. Ferrus Manus immediately sensed the change in him. The Primarch of the Iron Hands evaluated Fulgrim silently, his expression setting granite resolve. What he saw did not inspire trust. Fulgrim's movements were too calculated, his eyes too bright, his confidence too absolute. Whatever brother he had once known had been touched by something dark and dangerous. Fulgrim attempted to draw Ferrus into Horus's vision, appealing to his brother's pride, his resentment, and his desire for strength unbound by imperial doctrine. But Ferrus Manus did not yield. His loyalty to the Emperor was unwavering, and the quiet fury building within him made his stance unmistakably clear. There would be no alliance, no sympathy, no compromise. The rejection struck Fulgrim deeply. Their bond, once defined by shared craftsmanship, mutual respect, and the legendary forging on Terra, now felt fractured. A sense of betrayal flooded the Phoenician, twisted further by the demonic influence whispering just beyond his thoughts. Where once he had seen Ferrus as a trusted rival and beloved brother, Fulgrim now saw an obstacle. Ferrus's refusal marked the breaking point. The tension between them erupted into violence. Steel flashed in the dim light as they clashed with the fury of gods. Ferrus Manus fought with raw, unyielding force, every strike designed to bring Fulgrim to his senses, or failing that, to break him. Fulgrim, however, moved with lethal elegance, his skill sharpened by corruption and enhanced by the unnatural awareness granted by the Laer blade. The duel tore through the sanctum, shattering hololithic displays and denting adamantium pillars. Servitors froze in place, terrified to intervene. Sparks raised across the floor as their blades met again and again, each impact echoing through the ship like thunder. For a time, they were evenly matched, Ferrus with his relentless power, Fulgrim with impossible precision. But the tide slowly shifted. Fulgrim's speed increased to inhuman levels. His strikes became unpredictable and vicious, driven by the warping influence that gnawed at his soul. Ferrus, though formidable, could not match the escalating unnatural fluidity in Fulgrim's movements. A slash tore through the Gorgon's shoulder guard. Another staggered him. A sudden burst of speed sent him crashing into a bulkhead. Fulgrim pressed the advantage. With a final combination of blindingly fast movements, a disarm, a strike to the solar plexus, and a calculated blow to the base of the skull, Ferrus Manus collapsed. The impact sent dust and shattered glass across the sanctum floor as the Primarch fell unconscious. Fulgrim stood over him, chest rising and falling, blade trembling not from exertion, but from the predatory instinct of the demon within it. The silver blade of Laer urged a finishing stroke. The temptation lingered, sharp, hungry, intoxicating. But Fulgrim hesitated. The weight of their shared past pressed down upon him. the weapons they forged together, the campaigns they won side by side, the rare bond that had once defined them. For a moment, he teetered on the edge of an irreversible act. Then, with visible struggle, Fulgrim pulled back. He sheathed the blade and turned away from Ferrus's prone form. He would not kill his brother, not yet. His pride would not let him sully their history with a strike dealt in secret, nor could he bear to look upon the result. As Fulgrim departed the Fist of Iron, the ship's crew remained frozen with dread. The next time the two Primarchs met would not be in conversation or argument. The mask was gone. Fulgrim was no longer a seeker of perfection. He had become its monster, and in the warp, the Dark Prince laughed. The loyalist legions descended upon Isstvan V with purpose in their hearts and the Emperor's judgment in their hands. The Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard charged across the black sands of the Urgal Depression in a spear thrust meant to break Horus's rebellion before it could consume the galaxy. Among the traitors stood Fulgrim, clad in shimmering violet gold, as composed as a sculptor contemplating his next masterpiece. He watched the loyalists advance with serene confidence. The trap was already set, the performance already composed. He waited only for the signal. When the flare burst in the sky, the truth revealed itself like a blade hidden within silk. The so-called reinforcements, the Alpha Legion, Word Bearers, Night Lords and Iron Warriors, turned their weapons not upon the traitors, but upon the loyalists. The drop site massacre began in a single treacherous breath. The black sands shook beneath orbital fire. Loyalist ranks shattered upon sudden betrayal, their lines dissolving into chaos and blood. Sonic shrieks from Emperor's children weapons tore through armour and flesh alike, each screamer noting the rising symphony of slaughter. Fulgrim descended the cliffs like a dancer gliding onto a stage. He did not wade into the melee with the fury of Angron or the relentless inevitability of Mortarion. Instead, he moved with calculated elegance. Each strike a brushstroke, each kill a flourish, each scream a deliberate point in the unfolding masterpiece of ruin. Yet even as he fought, he searched for someone. Ferrus Manus. The bond forged at the anvil, in fire, sweat, pride and mutual respect, had become a fracture that ran straight through Fulgrim's soul. Their clash aboard the Fist of Iron had ended without resolution, leaving only bitterness and unfinished consequence. He found Ferrus amid the carnage, leading from the front as he always had. Forgebreaker raised high, face set in grim determination. Even amidst betrayal, the Primarch of the Iron Hands was unyielding. He cut down traitors with mechanical precision, refusing to break even as his legion splintered around him. Fulgrim felt a strange tightness in his chest as he approached, something between anticipation and dread. There was no conversation, no plea, no hope left between them. They clashed like thunder. Forgebreaker met Fireblade in a spray of sparks that lit the battlefield. Ferrus fought with raw, pounding fury of a wounded god, each blow intended to end the betrayal with a single devastating strike. Fulgrim countered with devastating speed and impossible grace, slipping through gaps in Ferrus's guard with the fluidity of a serpent. The ground fractured beneath their feet. Ash storms rose around them. The legions around them became ghosts, a blurred backdrop to the tragedy unfolding at the centre. The duel did not tilt gently one way or another. Ferrus dominated it. For every elegant strike Fulgrim delivered, Ferrus answered with crushing power. Fulgrim's precision met Ferrus's raw strength, and it was strength that carried the advantage. Sparks and molten fragments exploded around them as blow met blow. Ferrus forced Fulgrim back step by step, refusing to give him space to breathe or recover. Every strike from Fireblade hammered Fulgrim's defences, each shockwave rattling his bones. Fulgrim parried, pivoted, deflected, but Ferrus pushed harder. The moment of turning came suddenly. Ferrus seized a gap in Fulgrim's guard and struck Fireblade against Forgebreaker with such force that the hammer flew from Fulgrim's hands. A second blow smashed into Fulgrim's chest, driving him backward and leaving him dazed. A third shattered the ground beside Fulgrim's head. Fulgrim crawled back, breath sharp and panicked. For the first time in his life, the Phoenician had felt something he had never known: fear. Ferrus surged forward to finish the fight. Fulgrim's hand brushed the hilt of his secondary weapon, the silver blade of Laer. He had sworn never to use it against Ferrus. He had sworn never to let it influence him like this. But instinct, panic, desperation shattered those vows. Fulgrim drew the blade. The demon within struck instantly. It did not whisper. It did not tempt. It seized him. In one horrifying moment, Fulgrim's arm moved without consent, guided by a will older, darker and far more crueler than his own. His body twisted forward with unnatural speed. Ferrus saw it coming too late. The blade arced in a perfect, terrible line. One stroke, one flash of silver, and Ferrus Manus' head fell to the black sand. The world went silent. Fulgrim froze, staring at what his body had done. His mind screamed inside the prison of his own skull. Every thought, every memory, every ounce of love for his brother tore through him in a maelstrom of anguish. But his limbs no longer obeyed him. The demon lifted the blade in triumph. Inside, Fulgrim broke. He fell to his knees, unable to draw breath, unable to control his body as the entity within the weapon surged through him. Emotions collided inside him. Regret, horror, grief, revulsion, each one amplified and twisted until they shattered entirely. Ferrus Manus died that day on the black sands of Isstvan V. Fulgrim died with him. What remained was something else entirely. Something beautiful. Something monstrous. A creature sculpted from perfection, and broken beyond all repair. The phoenix had burned. Now it was ready to rise. Fulgrim, no longer merely a Primarch but a vessel of ambition unbound, had cast off the last remnants of shame. The demon within him had been expelled, not as an enemy, but as a tutor dismissed. He had tasted oblivion, wrestled back his will, and emerged with a revelation. He did not fear corruption, he embraced it. Perfection was no longer a distant star to reach for, it was a metamorphosis to be achieved, through excess, through experience, through divine elevation. He had transcended doubt, guilt, even love. All that remained was apotheosis. He would become a god, but even gods must earn their thrones. The path to demonhood required a rite, a sacrifice, and a deception. Fulgrim knew this, and so his gaze turned toward another of his brothers, one who still clung to logic and cold purpose, one who could be used. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors. They had never been close. Perturabo viewed Fulgrim's obsession with beauty as weakness, and Fulgrim considered the Lord of Iron a soulless machine. But they shared a common grievance. Both believed they had been denied the Emperor's favour. Both saw themselves as unloved, unappreciated, and misunderstood. Fulgrim approached him not as a manipulator, but as a mirror. He spoke of a weapon lost to myth, an ancient device buried deep within the Eye of Terror, a relic of the Eldar Empire, once used to annihilate entire stars. Fulgrim called it the Angel Exterminatus, a weapon so powerful it would guarantee victory for the traitor cause. Perturabo, ever the tactician, was intrigued. But it was a lie. There was no weapon, at least not in the sense Perturabo believed. Fulgrim's true purpose was to lead his brother into a web of prophecy, blood, and warp conversions necessary for his own ascension. The Eye of Terror awaited. Their combined fleets plunged into the warp storm like arrows through a wound. The galaxy they left behind fell silent. Within the Eye, the laws of physics unravelled. Stars bled colour, planets screamed, and somewhere in that nightmare, Fulgrim smiled. Because he had never felt more at home. They arrived at a world forgotten by reason. A chrome world known as Idris, once a jewel of the Eldar pantheon, now twisted beyond recognition. Its surface was a mosaic of shattered domes, haunted statues, and psychic echoes that clawed at the minds of mortals. Beneath its crust, buried deep, was the key to Fulgrim's transformation, a nexus of warp energy, an ancient altar of sacrifice, and a device, the Morgatar stone, capable of harvesting divine essence. But the stone needed fuel, and for that, Fulgrim had bought Perturabo. While the Iron Warriors deployed, Fulgrim played his part flawlessly. He acted the dutiful ally, even gifting Perturabo the very weapon he had once received from Ferrus Manus, Forgebreaker, as a symbol of brotherhood. The irony of using Ferrus's legacy to buy the trust of another was not lost on him. Perturabo accepted it, unaware. In the bowels of Idris, as the brothers explored ancient tunnels, Fulgrim's plan unfurled. He activated the Morgatar device, and with it, the trap was sprung. The stone began to siphon the essence of Perturabo, draining his strength, soul, and genetic purity, an offering to the gods Fulgrim now served without reservation. But fate, ever a trickster, intervened. A group of lawless survivors, Ironhands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, who had tracked the traitors through the warp now emerged. Warriors thought long dead at Isstvan. They struck at the heart of Fulgrim's ritual with fire and fury, breaking the circle of energy. The Morgottar stone fractured, unleashing a storm of warp light and wailing spirits. Perturobo, free from its grip, turned on his treacherous brother in rage. In a flash, Forgebreaker was in his hands. Fulgrim laughed, not with mirth, but anticipation. Perturobo brought down the hammer. The blow crushed Fulgrim's chest. Bone snapped, armour shattered. The sound echoed through the ruined halls of Idris like a funeral bell. The demon blade clattered to the floor. Fulgrim collapsed, blood pooled around him, viscous and violet. But he did not die, because death, for Fulgrim, was never the end. His body burned away, not in fire, but in ascension. The warp answered the unspoken call. Slaanesh, Lord of Excess, Prince of Pleasure, poured divine power into the broken vessel. Fulgrim's mortal shell writhed, twisted, unravelled, and was reborn. Where once stood a Primarch, now rose something far more terrible. Fulgrim, Demon Prince of Slaanesh. His form was no longer bound by humanity, his lower body elongated into a serpentine coil of scaled muscles and gleaming chitin. 4 arms burst from his torso, each bearing a different weapon: blade, whip, claw, and sceptre. His face shifted fluidly between sublime beauty and grotesque mockery, a visage that mirrored the desires and fears of all who beheld it. Even Perturobo, hardened, bitter, and unflinching, stepped back. Fulgrim thanked his brother for the final stroke and vanished in a shimmer of warp light, taking the remaining Emperor's children with him. The Iron Warriors were left on Idris, embittered and betrayed. From that day on, Fulgrim was no longer numbered among the sons of the Emperor. He was a prince of chaos, a godling of unbound sensation, and a herald of a new kind of damnation. His legion rejoiced. They viewed his transformation not as horror, but as a blessing. They had followed a Primarch, now they worshipped a god. And Fulgrim, in his new form, felt joy. Not the joy of conquest, not the joy of validation, but the joy of becoming something unique. He had transcended limits. The Emperor could no longer judge him. The galaxy could no longer contain him. He was freedom incarnate, glorious, obscene, eternal. In the warp, the Dark Prince of Chaos extended a hand. Fulgrim took it, and the stars wept. In the bleak years following the siege of Terra and the death of Horus, the galaxy reeled. The traitor legions were scattered, broken, and hunted across the stars during the long campaign that would become known as the Scouring. Some fled immediately into the Eye of Terror. Others resisted, lashing out in desperate counterstrikes. But a few, the most prideful and the most spite-driven, refused to retreat quietly. Fulgrim was one of them. He drifted through the void with his Emperor's children, not as a defeated warlord but as a creature liberated by ruin. No longer bound by the War Master's failures, no longer pretending to follow any greater vision, Fulgrim wrought devastation purely for his own pleasure. His legion splintered into warbands of sensory-hungry killers, and entire systems fell to their operatic violence. Yet even now, in his demon-touched ascension, one presence continued to haunt the Phoenician: Roboute Guilliman. For centuries after Isstvan, the two had never crossed paths, but when Guilliman's expanding fleet pressed into regions Fulgrim haunted, their trajectories converged. Fulgrim, ever the performer, decided the Lord of Ultramar would not merely be defeated, he would be humiliated. It began as a running battle across multiple systems. Guilliman, commanding not only the remnants of the 13th Legion but 6 of its successor chapters, found Fulgrim's forces apparently on the retreat, scattered, outmatched, and unwilling to stand and fight. Each skirmish ended the same way: Emperor's children's detachments falling back, always just out of reach. Guilliman pursued, and Fulgrim let him. The chase ended in the Thalassa system, a place of no strategic value. That alone should have sparked caution, but Fulgrim staged the opening act with precision. His fleet appeared battered and desperate, its formation broken. Guilliman ordered the attack, and the trap snapped shut. From behind Thalassa's moon, warp shadows and false signals, Fulgrim's true fleet emerged. A vast armada of Emperor's children vessels gleaming with sickening iridescence, hulls carved like obscene sculptures. They encircled the Loyalist line with a predator's grace. The Loyalists were outnumbered and trapped. Fulgrim watched from the bridge of the Pride of the Emperor, savouring Guilliman's tightening expression as entire successor flanks were obliterated by warp-twisted sonic barrages. Guilliman reorganised, carving a defensive corridor with the brilliance that had once built half the Imperium. But the pressure was immense. Every moment saw another frigate reduced to crystalline dust. Then Fulgrim made his next move. The pride of the Emperor's void shields collapsed. Not by accident, by design. Guilliman saw an opportunity to end the battle at the source. He ordered an immediate teleport strike, himself at the forefront, leading an elite team of Ultramarines and successor warriors. He materialised deep within Fulgrim's flagship, exactly where Fulgrim wanted him. The throne hall was an architectural nightmare of living marble, pulsing colours, and sculpted agony. Fulgrim waited in the centre, serene and luminous, radiating a presence that could unmake weaker minds with proximity alone. Guilliman advanced. The duel began, a clash of two philosophies, two legacies, two sons of the Emperor raised to reshape the galaxy. Fulgrim moved with impossible fluidity, wings unfurling as four daemonic arms wove arcs of shimmering lethality. Guilliman countered with precise efficiency, each strike honed by centuries of discipline. Fulgrim did not want only victory, he wanted corruption. He pressed psychic and emotional distortions through the air, attempting to drown Guilliman in a haze of warp sensation. Guilliman resisted, but resistance cost him dearly. The battle raged across the hall. At a critical moment, Guilliman gained the advantage, nearly driving his blade home. He signalled for his strike team. Fulgrim answered the call instead. Hidden passages burst open, walls peeled apart to reveal noise marines, cacophony elites, demon-bound champions. Guilliman's escort was torn down in a storm of shrieks and impossible harmonics. The distraction was decisive. Fulgrim produced a slim, wicked blade coated in toxins drawn from the warp itself. Guilliman shifted his guard, a fraction too late. Fulgrim struck. The blade pierced Guilliman's throat, a mortal wound. His sons dragged their dying Primarch back to the teleportorium. Only a handful of loyalist craft survived the retreat. The rest were obliterated as the Emperor's children tore through the loyalist line in a final exultant symphony. Fulgrim watched the last loyalist ship flee with quiet satisfaction. He had not merely defeated Guilliman, he had shattered him, and so the performance was complete. The stars had moved on. Millennia passed since Fulgrim's laughter faded from the walls of holy terror. The Horus heresy became legend, then scripture, then half-remembered myth. The Imperium endured, scarred and fracturing, clinging to the memory of an emperor who had once walked among men. And yet, in the darkest corners of reality, Fulgrim remained. Not as a commander, nor a brother, nor even a father to his legion. Those roles had long withered. He was now a shadow among gods, a being of sensation and will, whose name was uttered in secret and whose touch could be felt through silk, steel, and scream. He slumbered through the age of apostasy. He watched from beyond the veil during the time of ending. And when the galaxy tore itself apart with the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum, Fulgrim stirred. The Great Rift, the psychic wound that split the galaxy in two, was a chorus of agony and transformation. Across 1,000,000 worlds, reality bled, empires crumbled, faith burned. Fulgrim, cooled deep within his crystalline palace in the warp, opened his many eyes and smiled. The Imperium was gasping, and he had never enjoyed anything more. But this time, he did not descend with fire and sword. He sent whispers, a touch on the brush of an artist, a breath down the neck of a noble, a dream in the mind of a gifted child. Across the Segmentum Obscurus, cults dedicated to the perfect prince began to bloom. They did not speak of chaos or demons. They spoke of beauty, of ascension, of breaking the chain between pain and pleasure. They wore masks shaped like Fulgrim's face. They sang his praises in cathedrals made of glass and skin. In the Screaming Vortex, remnants of the Emperor's children had long since given up order. They warred with each other in pleasure barges that drifted like diseased comets, shrieking through warp lanes. Each warband worshipped a different version of Fulgrim. Some saw him as a divine artist, others as a lover, the god of reflection, or the serpent saint. Their numbers had thinned, but their depravity had deepened. Then, for the first time in 10,000 years, Fulgrim walked among mortals again. He began to covet purpose. He pondered the Imperium, the Emperor, and the sons who had outlived their father's dream. And slowly, a new desire took shape. Not merely revenge, not chaos, not destruction, ascendance. Fulgrim became convinced that the Emperor's vision had been flawed, incomplete, painfully restrained. Humanity's potential, he believed, was not to be shepherded, but to be perfected. Not through discipline or sacrifice, but through transformation on a scale only he could understand. Across demon worlds and heretic courts, Fulgrim began to speak his ambition aloud. He would not remain a creature haunting the edges of the eye. He would not let Guilliman, Dawn, or the resurgent Imperium claim the galaxy unchallenged. Fulgrim declared a new purpose. He intends to conquer the Imperium itself, to break the shackles of its stagnant order, to reshape humanity in the image of his impossible ideal, to ascend the steps of the Imperial Palace not as a conqueror alone, but as the embodiment of perfection. And when the Golden Throne at last falls silent, when the Emperor's corpse no longer binds humanity's fate, Fulgrim believes he will be the one to sit upon it, not as a tyrant, not as a monster, but as a god of beauty, perfection, and exquisite evolution. It is a vision he whispers now to those few who still dare seek him, a dream he carries through the warp like a promise. And in the shifting light of the Immaterium, among mirrors that sing and statues that breathe, Fulgrim, the demon prince, the broken sun, the sculptor of ruin, smiles. The Phoenician has not finished with humanity. Not by far. You have received the full transmission of Dominissimo Voxlore. The tale of Fulgrim ends not with death, but with transcendence. A demon prince not bound by flesh, nor judged by victory, but remembered in every soul corrupted by the pursuit of something beautiful. He is not gone. He is every ambition twisted, every genius unmoored, every perfection pursued past the edge of sanity. Subscribe and join those who see through the mirror without blinking. Refuse and be forgotten, plain and unloved by the gods. Until the next transmission, be beautiful, be brilliant, but never be unafraid.